How can the enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act protect farmers, ranchers, and cattlemen against what's happening in big ag right now? And in turn, I think your points earlier about consumer freedom, how could it help lower prices for consumers, in your opinion?
The Packers and Stockyards Act is a gold standard piece of legislation that actually was passed after the Sherman Act, and largely because Congress saw what the courts had done to interpretation of the Sherman Act and unduly narrowed it, and so gave the ranchers and farmers essentially a law that looks a lot like Section 5 of the FTC Act, which prohibits unfair methods of competition and certain so-called UDAP violations. And even then,
Senator Cory Booker opened with frustration about the disorder in the hearing, calling it chaos. Despite time constraints, he pressed forward with two sharp questions on issues of corporate concentration, agricultural markets, and the growing ties between government and powerful business interests.
This whole hearing has been chaos, Democrats and Republicans working together and being generous and magnanimous. This can't stand in Washington right now. But I do have two quick questions. Unfortunately, I have to run, and I'm going to yield back to the chairperson. And Ms. Mecki, they're both for you, if you don't mind. So the first is just going back to Mr. Bullard's points about the Stockers and Packyard Act. I just really want to drive down, and he was saying very pointedly that there's some rulemaking processes going on now that would be a lot more efficient. Now, you helped bring the first Packers and Stockyards Act case the agency had brought in years. This was a lawsuit against the fifth largest poultry processor. We've heard from Josh Hawley about what's happened to the chicken industry in the United States, which is this massive consolidating going on, exercises of power that I found stunning and hurting poultry. In fact, I often think that what they're trying to do to the cattle industry is what they've already done to the poultry industry. How can the enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act protect farmers, ranchers, and cattlemen against what's happening in big ag right now? And in turn, I think your points earlier about consumer freedom, how could it help lower prices for consumers, in your opinion?
The Packers and Stockyards Act is a gold standard piece of legislation that actually was passed after the Sherman Act, and largely because Congress saw what the courts had done to interpretation of the Sherman Act and unduly narrowed it, and so gave the ranchers and farmers essentially a law that looks a lot like Section 5 of the FTC Act, which prohibits unfair methods of competition and certain so-called UDAP violations. And even then, you saw courts interpreting the Packers and Stockyards Act in ways that were unduly narrow. And so we did two things when we saw evidence that two chicken processors had really behaved in a borderline tyrannical manner in something called the tournament system, where chicken growers are kind of subject to these arbitrary rules and the whims of processors, even though they really have very little control over the yields that the chickens that they grow ultimately bear out in the market. And so we did two things. We looked out and we saw the Packers and Stockyards Act and reprised the role of the Justice Department as the lawyers for the executive branch, and had that delegation, that authority delegated over to us so that we could bring the first Packers and Stockyards Act case for the first time in recent memory, maybe ever. We could not find an example of the Antitrust Division bringing a Packers and Stockyards Act case. The second thing that we did, and I should say my former deputy, Michael Cadis, I think is in the hearing room and did extraordinary work with the USDA to start working on rules under the Packers and Stockyards Act to bring fairness to these markets. And so it is my hope that the Trump administration will continue that work and that effort to, again, just bring free markets and fair dealing to chicken growers and all of the other kinds of growers and ranchers that will benefit from that kind of rulemaking.
So Abraham Lincoln said, too much agreement kills a conversation. So let me insinuate some partisan nature of this conversation. But in all seriousness, Democrat and Republican presidents have failed, in my opinion, to bring aggressive enforcement to the level that we need to deal with the large corporate concentration that's from the healthcare industry, from farms to pharma, let's put it that way. But I am concerned that we have an administration right now, and I agree with Mr. Alford's quoted in his testimony, the alliance between big business and big government must be broken. I have a lot of concerns right now with the president's alliance with certain big businesses, specifically Elon Musk. Is this kind of corporate connectivity, in your opinion, hurting average Americans?
I think that the president's decision to bring in the richest man on planet Earth and give him what appears to be unfettered access to our federal agencies, our most sensitive, intimate financial data, and other kinds of information about the American people really is a playground for potential malfeasance. And I think we started to see that as soon as Inauguration Day, where you saw the richest people on planet Earth in the Capitol Rotunda, warm, and the people who helped put Mr. Trump in office were outside, cold, unable to see what happened. And so it sends a message about who the president is for. And I think the antitrust agencies deserve to sort of rise and fall on their own merits and based on the decisions that they make with the authority that's entrusted to them. And I think that there are some examples of really good work there. There are other parts of the administration that really give me a lot of anxiety and a lot of pause about the incredible power that we've entrusted to the executive branch. And so whether it's Mr. Musk's ambitions in space, whether it's his ambitions in potential payment platforms, they're sort of the recipe for conduct that could really hurt people, and I think it deserves very close scrutiny.
On protecting farmers and consumers, Booker highlighted the alarming consolidation in the poultry industry, warning that cattle ranchers risk facing the same fate. He asked how the enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act, PSA, could shield farmers, ranchers, and ultimately consumers from predatory corporate practices. The witness explained that the PSA was enacted after the Sherman Act to give ranchers protections against unfair competition. Despite courts historically narrowing its scope, the DOJ revived its enforcement role by bringing the first PSA case in years against a major poultry processor. This case targeted abusive practices like the tournament system, which leaves small chicken growers at the mercy of processors despite having little control over outcomes. Beyond litigation, DOJ and USDA also began rulemaking to strengthen fairness in agricultural markets. On corporate government alliances, Booker then pivoted to a broader concern, the entrenched alliance between big business and government. While he criticized both Democratic and Republican administrations for failing to rein in corporate concentration, he raised new alarm over the Trump administration's ties with Elon Musk. Booker questioned whether giving the richest man on Earth unfettered access to federal agencies and sensitive data was harming everyday Americans. The witness strongly agreed, warning that this creates a playground for potential malfeasance. He contrasted wealthy elites' privileged presence at Trump's inauguration with ordinary supporters left outside in the cold, symbolizing who government truly serves. He expressed anxiety about Musk's sprawling influence in space, payments, and sensitive tech sectors, suggesting unchecked power poses risks to American democracy and consumer freedom. Booker closed by reinforcing that unchecked alliances between government and monopolistic corporations undermine both free markets and public trust. Aggressive enforcement of laws like the Packers and Stockyards Act, he stressed, is not just about protecting farmers and ranchers, but about defending consumers and American democracy from corporate overreach.